Good afternoon, good evening, and salam, and bonjour from France. My name is Katarzyna, and I am a member of the Macfest team, and I am delighted to welcome you to the Macfest 2023. This evening, we are thrilled to host Ottoman Encounters, Henrietta Liston's travels and Turkish travels, and this is the first event of our Library and Museum Festival. Our host for this event is Dr. Patrick Hart, the curator for Scottish communities and organizations at the National Library of Scotland. And I hope you will enjoy it. So please follow Macfest and Muslim Women's Arts Foundation on our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Connect with us and spread the word about the festival using the hashtag #SpreadHoney, And one more thing, a big thank you from Macfest to all of you for your donations. We welcome and appreciate every single one of them. They help us run all these unique and wonderful events for you. So please join us in the future on more events. Most of them are free. Thank you again, and over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody from Scotland, and I think also Merhaba from Turkey too. We're delighted to be part of the Museum and Libraries Festival, and we're really honored to be here to help kick off Macfest 2023. We're really delighted to be contributing to Macfest for the first time, and we hope this is going to be the beginning of a long relationship. I wanted to say a big thank you too to everybody on the Macfest team, and especially the amazing Kestra for inviting us here. We'd also like to thank you all for giving up your Saturday afternoons, if it is the afternoon where you are, and or giving up your time to join us. So I'd like to begin, if I may, by introducing Dr. Berak Burçak, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Bilkent University in Ankara. We're really delighted that she's been able to join us for this talk. She's a specialist in 19th century Ottoman history. She's written on Ottoman Muslim female beauty, health, hygiene, and fashion, on Ottoman women's identity, and on many other topics relating to that period. So we're really lucky to have her joining us today. I'd also like to introduce my colleague Dora Petherbridge, who's our International Collections Curator at the National Library of Scotland. Dora's been working on Henrietta and Robert Liston and their archive, which is going to form the focus of our talk for 6 years now. And she knows this archive better than anybody. So before we get into the body of our talk, we'd like, if we may, to begin by taking a moment to remember the victims of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. We send our condolences to anyone who's lost anyone close to them or been otherwise affected by these tragic events. To everyone else, we'd like to ask you, if you can, to consider donating to support the ongoing relief work. There's a lot of ways you can do that, and I'm sure many of you will have already given generously. But if you haven't yet been able to, and you're not sure how, I'm sharing on the screen just one way you can donate, which is through the RBAP organization. There's a QR code on the screen if you want to scan that, and if I can, I'm also going to drop a link into the chat. Bilkent University, where I also formerly worked, has been doing a great deal of work to support students and staff affected by the earthquake. And Bilkent would also welcome donations to this scheme. And I'm going to hand over to Berak to say a few words about this.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. So Bilkent is actually taking an active role in helping out the earthquake victims, and it has been a disastrous earthquake in Turkey. So one way to support this effort is a fundraising campaign for helping out those Bilkent students who were directly affected by the earthquake. So you might want to donate by using this QR code. It might be a one-time donation, or it could be a donation over, a couple of months or a couple of years. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Barak. And thank you, everybody. So I'm going to begin by introducing our talk. I'll explain a little bit about why we wanted to talk about this topic at the Muslim Arts and Culture Festival. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague Dora, who will say a bit more about Henrietta Liston, the starting point for our talk, and about the project we've been working on. Then Barak is going to set the Ottoman contexts for us, telling us a bit about the role of women in Ottoman culture and society. We'll then move on to look in a bit more detail at Henrietta Liston's writings about her meetings and encounters with Ottoman women and Ottoman culture more generally. We'll wrap up by talking about some of the responses to Liston's writings by 21st century Turkish women that have been commissioned by the National Library of Scotland. We'll then open up the session to questions and maybe a wider discussion. Please, if at any point you have any questions, do put them into the chat. We'll try and keep an eye on that as we go and either address them then, or we'll come back to them at the end and try to answer them properly there. So the National Library of Scotland, this is us here. This is where Dora is currently sitting, somewhere in this enormous bunker. Holds around 30 million individual items. If you put all our shelves end to end, they stretch from around Glasgow to Gretna Green on the English border. So we have vast collections, and many of these items reflect the long history both of Islam in Scotland and of Scotland's relationship with the wider Muslim world. And just to give an example, I wanted to show you a miniature Quran held in our rare books collection, and the penny there gives you an idea of the size. As many of you will know, there's an amazing tradition of miniature Qurans in manuscript, but printing them became possible only in the late 19th century with photolithographic technology. And tiny Qurans were published in Delhi and Istanbul, but the one which achieved the widest circulation was this edition, which was produced by David Bryce and Son in Glasgow around 1900. Every copy came with this metal locket incorporating a magnifying glass. And many of these were supplied to Muslim soldiers who were fighting alongside the British in the First World War. And it was in this context that the book was mentioned by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. In his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he writes of Alda told me later in strict confidence that he had bought a miniature Quran for £120 13 years before and had not since been wounded. Lawrence goes on to note the book was one of the little Glasgow reproductions costing 18 pence in England. So the The Bryce Quran, I think, is fascinating and beautiful, just one example from our collections. But it is also an example of how the library's collections reflect Scotland's involvement in British imperialism. Many of our collection items are entangled in often complex ways in a long history of Islamophobia and Orientalist prejudice. We do hold rich collections of writing by Muslims and those of Muslim heritage. As a library, we know we need to do more to make sure that Muslim voices are fully represented in our collections and that Muslim communities have full access to our resources. That's one reason we were so delighted to be invited by Kestra to participate in Macfest, and we're so anxious to be involved. Now, we hope that this will be the beginning of an ongoing collaboration. And in future talks, we're planning to celebrate those Muslim voices directly. But Muslims still appear in our collections most often as the subjects of Western, particularly Scottish writers, where they're often left voiceless, misrepresented, orientalized. And I think this is perhaps especially true in the case of Muslim women. So as a library, we need to be looking carefully at how we present such texts and how we respond to them. And if we want to challenge and break down Islamophobia, we need to understand it and to look at historical examples of how it can be broken down. So today, the starting point for our talk is the writings of Henrietta Liston, a white Scottish Christian woman in her 60s. Now, in 1812, Liston traveled to Istanbul with her husband, Robert, who had been appointed British ambassador. While she was there, they didn't finally return to Scotland until 1820, some 8 years later. Henrietta wrote in often minute detail in her letters and diaries about her experiences and encounters, particularly with Ottoman women from the urban elite. Now, Liston took with her to Turkey many of the stereotypes and the prejudices about Islam and the Middle East that her time and upbringing had imprinted on her. So we find in her writing allusions to Oriental despotism and tyranny, to Oriental sensuality, and to Islam as a fatalistic religion, to Muslims as superstitious or given to plotting. At her worst, we find her uncritically repeating well-worn Orientalist myths as facts, such as the story that enslaved women in the Sultan's harem were frequently put into sacks and thrown into the sea in order to prevent further children with potential claims to the throne being born. So Liston's writings can make for disturbing reading, and we want to flag this up for everyone. Her writing can be disturbing in other ways too. And I think, as Dora might touch upon, Liston was raised in a society whose economic base was founded on slavery and racism. And this is reflected in the way she writes of slavery and race in Ottoman society as well. So there's Islamophobia and prejudice in Liston's writing, and we have to confront that. There is, though, also, I think, a remarkable and genuine curiosity about Ottoman life and an engagement with Islamic culture and with the various individuals she meets, and especially the women. She's repeatedly surprised by the Ottoman women she encounters, by their humor, their friendliness, their intelligence, the ways their appearance and behavior doesn't conform to the Orientalist stereotypes. Maybe what surprises her most, I think, is Ottoman women's agency. And again, we're dealing with the urban elite here, something Barak, I know, is going to talk about too. Liston is impressed by and refers to these women's ability to influence their own lives and those around them, in contrast to common Orientalist myth. So when Liston writes about meeting Ottoman women, eating with them, communicating with them, we see possibilities opening up. And I don't want to overstate this. In Liston's writing, we find, I think, in some ways, a very human mix of prejudice and preconception, rubbing up against human sympathy and newly lived experiences. And so her writing, I think, offers an intriguing case study for anyone who's interested in bringing Muslims and non-Muslims together and overcoming Islamophobia. Her writings are also very valuable historical evidence of the culture of Ottoman women, of the urban elite in particular, as seen by a foreigner with unusual levels of access and an unusual perspective. Now, by commissioning responses by 21st century Turkish women to Liston's work, the library is looking to continue to open up and continue the dialogues that Liston's Ottoman hosts really made possible. We hope that our talk will complement the talk coming up in March, the conversation between Dr. Nafisa Ali and Professor Siobhan Lambert-Hurley about 3 centuries of travel writing by Muslim women. I hope you can see that on the screen now. We'd recommend that event to you as a nice complement and sort of parallel to this look at Western writing about Turkey. But I'm going to hand over now to Dora, who will say a little bit more about the Listons and about the library's collaborative project. Thank you. Dora, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you. So to begin, I'll say a little bit about how we know about all these encounters. And maybe, Patrick, you can stop sharing the PowerPoint just for a moment. Thank you. So here I am in the National Library in Edinburgh, National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, and in the stack floors, the many stack floors underneath where I'm sitting, is an amazing manuscript archive. It's really a diplomatic archive, an archive of a professional diplomat's career spanning 50 years. And that's what all of our research into the Listons has been based on. And I know what Patrick said, I've been working on the archive for 6 years, but it's really big, and I still feel like there's so much more to know, and I've only just scraped the surface of all the hundreds and hundreds of documents. Sorry, my light's gone off, it's motion censored. Hundreds of documents that it contains. I've pulled 2 up. I hope it's going to be light enough for you to see them. So from the stacked floors underneath where I sit, I've pulled up one very significant manuscript, the one that we're going to be basing most of our talk around, and I hope you'll be able to see it enough. This is Henrietta Liston's journal from 1812. So it's the journal that she wrote in Istanbul. I won't open it because that wouldn't be very conservation friendly, but here it is, and it's titled, there we are, Liston's Travels.
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. And as an example, a very hefty volume of manuscripts. This one is one of many in the archive. It's entitled Constantinople with Liston in gold on the spine there. And this has hundreds of manuscripts dating from Robert and Henrietta Liston's time in the Ottoman Empire in it, but it is one of many. So we've drawn from all of these sources to tell you the stories we're going to be telling today. And I know we've got people from the US and from Canada. So the Listons were also there in 1796. They went to the United States and stayed until 1800. And there are many, 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 many manuscripts dating from their North American travels as well. So this archive is really an extremely well-preserved record of Robert and Henrietta Liston's personal relationships, their domestic life, their social activities, their purchases, their travels, and their diplomatic work. It's full of unique, wonderful, revealing, mysterious, touching, and maddening documents. And where it relates to the Ottoman Empire, it is really full of the people of 19th century Istanbul, which of course the Listons knew of as Constantinople. And there are hundreds of diplomatic and cultural connections to be found in the archive, many of which still wait to be researched and revealed. Where we meet Henrietta in the archive, which is kind of predominantly defined by her husband's work, is in middle age. And maybe we can get our slideshow back now, Patrick, and just the first slide after your last. So here I am in the stacks trying to locate our middle-aged Scottish woman, because prior to her marriage to Robert in 1796, we don't know an awful lot about her. And it's really through this relationship with Robert Liston that she becomes visible to us at all. Had she not married him, we would not have probably known she existed. But there she is in the archive, and we've been able to trace her birth back to Antigua in 1751. And if we just go to the next slide. Yeah, either of those images will show you the kind of material that we are dealing with when we're searching for Henrietta's biographical details, and that give us all of these wonderful Ottoman connections. And the next slide as well gives you an idea of the variety of manuscripts. So if we flip to the next, there will be maps, wonderful official Ottoman documents, as well as Henrietta Liston's own writings. And to the next slide will bring us to their portraits. Now, these portraits were painted in Philadelphia in 1800, where the Listons were living at that time. This was not long after Henrietta had married Robert. So Henrietta was born in 1751 and got married in 1796 at the age of 44, which is late for this period of time. And she didn't think that marriage was going to be the way that her life went. She lived for a long time with her uncle, who was her guardian, in Glasgow, very secluded. And I've got a small quote that I'll just read to you, because although she kind of had her eye on Robert and they were friends, she said that marrying in advanced life, except in very particular cases, is capital in my list of follies. But Robert made an unexpected proposal to her in 1796, and she accepted. She was, I think, rather in love with him. And from that point, her world changed, and she became a diplomat's wife, and everything that entailed: travel on an international scale, diplomatic work, socializing with kind of political weight behind it. And she had not been born into this way of life. She was orphaned at the age of 8, but well, by the age of 8, she had lost both parents. We don't quite know exactly when they died. And she was sent from her home in Antigua, which was then a British colony, to Glasgow. And there she stayed until she met Robert, who was a Scottish diplomat of some renown. And after that marriage, her life changed. Can we go to our next slide, if we've still got the, yes, wonderful. And she would have had no idea that her journals were going to be published and broadcast and talked about. She probably would be rather shocked to know that we were doing this event centered around her own private diaries. But we have published them. We have put them online. They've been digitized, they've been exhibited. And in, I think it was about 2018, Patrick and I were working on this vast archive here at the National Library, and Patrick had the brilliant idea of doing a project centered on Henrietta Liston's Turkish travels. And from that came this book that you can see on screen, as well as an online resource and a series of new responses to her work. So we'll say a little bit more about it at the end, but you'll be able to see everything, all the text that we talk about online. And as you can see from this slide, we've digitized her journals. They were taken down to the conservation studio here, looked after, preserved, put under a scanner, and then onto the World Wide Web. And I'm sorry, Henrietta, I think you would be mortified. I can say a little bit more about her character. We can go to the next slide, because by the time we meet her in 1812, she's traveled to the United States, living in Philadelphia for 4 years, moving around, meeting George Washington and the other founding fathers. But she's not, as I said, a traditional expected diplomat's wife. She's not aristocratic. She's much older, and she's Scottish, and she didn't come from a family of ambassadors. And in fact, nor did Robert. His origins were relatively humble. He came from a family of farmers. So we get a little insight into her before they arrive in Constantinople. As you can see on the screen, we've got Lady Hester Stanhope, who was the kind of pinnacle of aristocratic female travelers of the period. And she is extremely snobby about Henrietta. She says, "She will be laughed at Constantinople, I am sure, and particularly if General Androssi brings his charming wife with him. What a contrast." And then we'll go to the next slide, and Lady Hester Stanhope's lover, Michael Bruce, writes back, having met Henrietta, and saying, "Mrs. Liston is short and thick, with the most aureate features I ever saw, and I should not think not half so genteel as your housekeeper, Mrs. Brown. She is forward in conversation, has a dash of Scotch cleverness and a considerable one of Scotch vulgarity." So how accurate a portrayal this was, we will never quite know. Aureate means, aureate is a Scots word, and it means kind of odd, unattractive, possibly even ugly, which I don't think that you get from those wonderful portraits of Gilbert Stuart's, but that was the snobbishness of Michael Bruce and Lady Hester Stanhope. Henrietta was not fashionable. She was not deemed to be sexy, and she was not rich like the other aristocratic wives. She was definitely unconventional. However, she made a very successful diplomat's wife. She had a talent for friendship. She was curious. She was forward in conversation. Maybe she was, and that went in her favor. She could strike up friendships seemingly wherever she went in the world very quickly. And what we know is that people warmed to her. I think in Turkey, it's a little different than in the United States, for example, or in the other European countries she visited, because she couldn't speak the language. Robert Liston, her husband, who was a wonderful linguist, and he could speak 10 languages, could speak Turkish, but she couldn't. So she was excluded from that kind of free conversation that she might have had with the women there, had she been able to speak the language. But we do know that she was especially good at making friends, and that therefore made her a very valuable asset as a diplomat's wife. I will hand back to Patrick in just one moment. I suppose what's maybe become evident is that there's so much that I could say about her life, her early life in Antigua, her experience of chattel slavery, what her secluded life was in Glasgow, and then her sudden arrival onto this international diplomatic stage. But the Turkish portion of her life is especially fascinating. And what survived from that is a series of wonderful travel journals dating from 1812 to 1820. And it's from those journals, which have survived all this time, that we're going to draw the passages that we'll explore and the encounters that we're going to describe to you today. To quickly, please ask me questions at the end and I can fill in some of the gaps. So Patrick is now going to take us deep into the texts of this wonderful journal. So I'll hand back to him. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Dora. Yeah, so I'll just say a few things very briefly about some of the encounters that that Henrietta writes about before passing over to Berak, who will give us a survey of Ottoman society and culture and women's place within that. So Henrietta is fascinated by all kinds of different aspects of the world she finds herself in Istanbul and traveling around the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given what Dora was saying about her own marriage, she's very interested in Turkish marriage ceremonies and rituals. She writes at one point that the Turkish ceremony of marriage is chiefly a contract signed or witnessed by a public magistrate. She's struck by the apparently legal status of it, and she notes the rights women receive in divorce settlements in Ottoman Turkey. She observes the customs of Ramadan. She notes how the fast is very rigidly performed. From the rising to the setting sun, no particle of food or drink enters their lips, nor can they enjoy during that time even the luxury of a pipe. And she's later offered a pipe to smoke in a very different context by a group of Ottoman women. But she also, again, following from what Dora was saying, she's very class conscious, and this brings again an interesting perspective to her observations, where so many Western travelers came from really sort of aristocratic backgrounds. So she notes of Ramadan that she says, to the laboring poor, the Ramadan is an affliction. Porters, sailors, boatmen, toiling in a burning sun from its rising to its setting, without permission to cool their parched lips. She's concerned about the poor that she sees around her. But as I said before, we do see these Orientalist sort of tropes coming out. So I'm not sure whether this qualifies, but when she's writing about Ramadan, she does blame the spread of the plague, and she writes a lot about some really fascinating stuff, which we can talk about later if anybody's interested. And there are lots of parallels with sort of recent times and COVID in her writing on the plague and the lockdown she lives in when she first arrives in Istanbul. But at one point she does blame the spread of the plague through Istanbul on what she describes as the free and constant intercourse of the Turks in eating and drinking through the night during Ramadan. She also, clothing and beauty is a focus of many of the encounters she has. So at one point when she's in the At Maidan in Istanbul, the hippodrome, she describes how 5 or 6 Turkish women collected around her, and she becomes alarmed, she writes, for women and children often insult strangers. Now, there's no evidence anywhere in accounts of her actual experiences of her ever being insulted. Quite the opposite. She's almost universally welcomed and received with great courtesy, great hospitality. But she writes of these women, their intention was to look at my dress and to know how I could be veiled so different from them. I lifted up the muslin which covered my face, at which they laughed, nodded, and went off, seeming to think me very good-natured. This is just one of these brief encounters relatively early in her account. We'll go on to look at some more detailed accounts later. Finally, for now, perhaps, there's a fascinating description of a visit the Listons pay to a Sufi dervish lodge. And Liston gives a long description, and it's fascinating again for this sort of tension between sort of Orientalist prejudice and a genuine fascination and appreciation. And this is an image of the palace of the British Embassy in which Henrietta Liston stayed during the period they were there. But at the end of her this long description of the visit to the Sufi dervish lodge, Henrietta writes, "The scene altogether was ridiculous, but not laughable." And it's a very interesting distinction worth pondering over. There was a quiet solemnity in their movements, a sort of grace in their obeisances, a melancholy paleness in their looks, which rendered it, with their sweet-toned flute, interesting. And I think you can sort of see that tension, the appreciation. There's an aesthetic quality to her writing here about this that mirrors the experience she's just been through. And there are some interesting signs that Robert Liston's interest in Sufism and the Bektashi Dervish Lodge, or tekke, might have gone quite deep. In the archive, we have a personal letter to Robert from somebody called Sayyid Mehmet Sayyid Baba, a Bektashi dervish, who was possibly a Sufi elder with whom Robert was a friend. And we're really indebted to Dr. Ines Asherich Todd of Edinburgh University, who's looked at this letter for us, and I think the handwriting is fascinating. It's a hesitant hand writing in Arabic, but with a slightly odd writing style. This is I'm speaking beyond my knowledge here, and I think Berak might have more to say about this kind of thing, but suggests an author who was maybe not comfortable with Arabic, but had Turkish as a natural language. And this letter is full of indications that Robert Liston was perhaps involved more deeply in some way with this dervish lodge. So there are all these connections, but before we look more closely at some of Liston's encounters, particularly with Ottoman women, I'm going to hand over to Berak to talk a little about Ottoman society in the early 19th century and some of the issues we need to bear in mind when we're talking about Ottoman women. Berak, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Good afternoon, everybody. Merhaba from Turkey. I'm honored and delighted to be here, to be talking to you today. And I would like to thank Kesra Shehraz and the MAC team, and Dora and Patrick for inviting me. Now, I'm supposed to be talking about Ottoman women and Islam, which are difficult subjects to talk about. And we are kind of looking into the period between 1812 and 1821, which falls within the reign of Sultan Mahmud II, which Patrick will show us a slide of soon. Now, I think here we see kind of Mahmud, one in traditional garb and one in a modern garb. I think Mahmud is an important reformist sultan because of the fact that not only did he make important kind of reforms pertaining to the state and society, but he also carried out an important dress reform pertaining to the military and male members of Ottoman society. It didn't apply to women, but it shows here kind of to what an extent dress as a category is important to culture, modernization, image, identity, and so forth. Now, if I'm to talk about Ottoman women, I have to say that this is a Janus-face term. It has a double kind of face. It is a generalization that unfortunately doesn't carry much of a representational value. I say, double-faced and representation reputational value because Ottoman women is a highly political and ideological category, which kind of stretches between fantasy and reality. Now, on the one hand, Ottoman women can be used as an umbrella term for women who lived in the Ottoman realms. You know, the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for almost 600 years, expanded over a vast territory, forming a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual society, which was marked by difference and diversity. The Ottoman state and society operated within, you know, the confines of Islam and patriarchy, and the status of an individual was determined vis-a-vis religious belief, gender, and social stratification. For example, the life and experiences of a 19th century Christian women living in the Balkans would be very different from that of a Muslim or a Jewish woman living in the Arab lands or in Anatolia. So the lives and experiences of urban women would also be very different from those women living in rural areas. Similarly, the standing of wealthy and elite women differed from ordinary or working women. So within this fragmented society, it's important to define the group of women in question in regard to space, time, geography, proximity to power, social standing, and age. Our focus today will be on Liston's interaction with elite Muslim urban women in, as I said, the reign of Sultan Mahmud II, residing in, you know, the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, Constantinople, and Bursa, which used to be an important economic and cultural center. At the time, it's still an important big city in modern-day Turkey today. And I guess one important feature of Ottoman culture, both during the 19th century and the earlier periods, was that Muslim women relegated to the private sphere were not expected or encouraged to be a part of the public space and public discussion. The statement by the 18th century German poet and dramatic author Friedrich Schiller, which goes along something along the lines of good states and good women are never the subject of discussion, was equally valid for Ottoman Muslim women. So as part of Islamic requirements, Muslim women were to be veiled when they went outdoors, and they had to observe gender segregation, okay, especially in public space. And palace and elite women did live in harems, which by Islamic law were indoor spaces impenetrable to all but women and male relatives. Now, on the other hand, fueled by orientalist and imperialist agendas, lies the stereotype of the Ottoman woman, which refers to Muslim women as a general category. Here, the Ottoman woman is a subjugated, oppressed, captive, passive, ignorant, and eroticized creature. She is, you know, a trope marking Western superiority vis-a-vis the East and Islam. Now, this is an image which is created by the imaginative European male accounts, drawing upon the so-called invisibility of Muslim women, marked by physical and cultural barriers maintained by the three main practices that I mentioned earlier: the veil, the harem, and gender segregation. Now, all these three practices rendered inaccessibility to Muslim women and European male travelers to the Ottoman Empire did not really see anything other than veiled women in the public sphere. So based on that and drawing upon their preconceived notions of space and power and the division and segregation of space that relegated Muslim women to the interior, European male accounts interpreted Ottoman women as prisoners, devoid of any individuality and agency in public life. Of course, this is not the case. So the obsession with breaching this cultural barrier became one of the defining features of European interaction with the Ottoman Empire. leading to a rich production of visual art and textual narratives that imagined vivid yet inaccurate detail the forbidden mysteries of the harem. Now, Henrietta Liston's text is interesting because it claims an accurate and authoritative information drawing upon, the female gaze herself, presenting a first-hand account of the interior where elite urban Ottoman Muslim women resided. So these accounts are a mixed bag, which include, on the one hand, a factual account of everyday Ottoman female domestic life with, special reference to bodily attributes, beautiness, ugliness, being fat or thin, kind of manners and characters, indoor decoration, indoor female garments, she kind of compares and contrasts Eastern with Western female kind of dress. She talks about eating habits. She talks about food and drink being served by, female servants of the harem. And on the other hand, her accounts are kind of marked with conflict. I mean, she kind of finds herself conflicting with what she sees, with that of, her Orientalist expectations and stereotypes, once again pertaining to Ottoman women, such as beauty or idleness and intrigue. So as we shall see, in the rest of the presentation, physical attributes, dress, customs, and manners are all cultural markers that work towards the shaping of identities, towards mostly differentiating, separating one culture from the other. But sometimes in Liston's accounts, they also serve as connecting, bringing women from two groups of women from two very different and distinct cultures. So over to you, Patrick, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Berak. Yeah, I'm aware that we don't have a great deal of time left, but we'd really like to share with you just a few of the particular descriptions that Liston goes into. And perhaps first among these is her visit to the harem of the Kaymakam, which she discusses, which took place on 17th of August, 1813. But before we look at her visit to a Turkish lady, Berak, I wondered if you could say a little bit about what is a Kaymakam and what do we need to know about this encounter? Okay,
now a Kaymakam is actually denotes a deputy for a high rank office. So in this case, we're actually talking about sort of Liston going to visit Mehmet Rüştü Pasha, who is actually filling in for the Grand Vizier Hurşit Ahmet Pasha, who is not, present as the Grand Vizier because he's on the battlefield, with in a war with Russia and so forth. So Liston is actually going to a very, she's almost going to the top. I mean, she's not visiting the imperial palace. This is not the imperial harem or anything, but she's nevertheless going to visit one of the high, Ottoman officials of the period. And the fact that she's kind of going, the fact that Mehmet Rüştü is filling in for, the Grand Vizier means that she's also visiting, the residence of the Grand Vizier in question. So she gets to see the best of, what she could hope to, I guess, encounter. So it's a very important visit. It's taking place, in Istanbul. And this is going to be, you know, one of the defining harem visits that's going to kind of have Liston, you know, kind of, how should I say, both, you know, talk about her preconceived notions mixing with factual, you know, evidence.
So in this, and this is a long account, and I'll share a link shortly in the chat to it for anybody who would like to go and read it for themselves. But there's some fascinating descriptions of clothing, and clothing seems to play a really important role in her exchanges with the Ottoman women she meets. There's this particular description where she's surrounded by the Pasha's ladies, as she puts it, as they're awaiting the lady of the house. And she's chosen this gown covered in embroidered with bugles, specifically because she thought it would be a novelty. And she says, I found it was so. And then she goes into this description of the corsets, where, and if it's okay, I'll just read this short passage. They particularly remarked the form which the corsets gave to the breast of my gown, and very freely regretted that their mode of dress, entirely without corsets or any substitutes, spoilt their shapes. Then in a little further on, she meets with the lady she's come to visit, who offers her the pipe I mentioned earlier. And they have an encounter focused around Liston's gloves. And we saw in that portrait of her the role the gloves play as a sort of marker, perhaps, of social distinction. She says there, she being the lady of the house, she seemed pleased when I drew off my gloves and expressed her surprise how I could support the constraint of them. I was both pleased and surprised at the frankness and kindness of her behavior. Berak or Dora, what can we say about these this focus on clothing and the role it plays in these exchanges?
Okay, as may I speak first? Is that okay? I guess clothing is a cultural marker, and it is going to be, because we're talking about women, it's going to be one of the markers in terms of something which is shared by both, both Ottoman and British women. It's going to come later on in the excerpt of the harem in Bursa, is the fact that both groups of women are interested in each other's clothes. They're interested in dressing up. Their clothes are a part of their elite status. Liston as the ambassador's wives and these, Pasha's wife. So it comes with kind of the status. It's a marker of status. But apart from that, it is also something not, which only unites, but it is also something which marks difference. The fact that Liston has a gown with a corset means that it is a, tight-fitting dress, which kind of shows the figure, and so forth. And kind of Ottoman women were not wearing corsets. That's something that's going to come later, but they're kind of bemoaning the fact that their dress is kind of not showing their waist and so forth. And the fact that Liston is wearing gloves, which is again something that comes with the fact that she's a genteel lady in itself. So I think these are both instances to kind of mark the character and the culture of Ottoman women, high-class Ottoman women in the harem. But it's also going to be something that is uniting both groups of women in their sort of pleasure and delight. So it's a way of both connecting and distancing two cultures, because appearance, whether it be in the sense of physical attributes or in the sense of clothes, is an important marker. Dora, if you would like to say something.
Yes, thanks. I think that naturally leads us on to another visit that following years, 1814, that the Listons go to Bursa and they look at silk production and the natural landscape, and Henrietta's likely to have collected botanical specimens from the plains. But she also is visited by and then makes return visits to Turkish women. And Berek and I, we've picked out an example of this interaction that leads on just from what you were saying, Berek, about the shared interest in clothes as a kind of communication tool. So I could read that, and this is a complex passage, and there is a lot to say about Liston's various emphases, and we've definitely got our eye on the time. So I'll try to whiz through this. So she's making a visit, and she writes, "Soon after our entrance, 3 female visitors were announced, and to my great surprise, the first in rank, and who immediately placed herself on the sofa with the mistress of the house, was black. My interpretess whispered to me that she was the wife of one of the most wealthy Turks in Bursa. Her features were not African. On the contrary, they were high, handsome, and her figure and manners good. She had on a feraji very ill suited to her complexion, beautiful olive cloth embroidered with gold, and as gloves make no part of a Turk's dress, very fine bracelets were displayed, covering, as is usual, a great part of the arms. I expressed my admiration of them, upon which she rose to show me them. The lady of the house then called a slave to show me a still finer pair of hers, so that vanity in dress is much the same in Turk or Christian." Berek, do you want to reflect a little on that?
Yes, of course. Now, I think one of the important things here is that I'll piggyback on what I said last, is that, dress is a shared passion in terms of both Ottoman and, British elite women. Now, what is kind of important here is that Liston emphasizes that the mistress is black, but she's not African. So I think she's rather surprised by the fact that she's not white, I guess. She's talking about the fact that although, she's black, she's beautiful, but her taste in clothing does not really suit her complexion. The ferace is this outer kind of coat for outdoor, for wearing if you're going out to public space. And she doesn't seem to think that it goes with, this woman's complexion. And now I think sort of race comes into the picture here. I think sort of aesthetics, women's aesthetics come into the picture in terms of Liston's Bursa visit, which is also the case of the former visit that she, carried out in Istanbul to Rüştü Paşa's. In that, there is this emphasis on beauty, or pertaining to the same period, which speculate upon the abundance of beauty in the harem. Liston's account is usually critical, but no less objectifying. She kind of tells us after her visit in terms of the Istanbul harem that she had not, she didn't find what she was expecting. She didn't find splendor, she didn't find female beauty. So I guess the fact that Liston is judging the harem women, you know, women's beauty or their lack of beauty. She's imposing the female gaze. This is no longer the male gaze, but the female gaze is still very much kind of tainted by male orientalist preconceptions. You know, physical attributes are an important part of, you know, cultural identity. So I think, as I said, appearance becomes a very important marker, cultural marker, you know, in terms of what is foreign, what belongs to the, you know, the West, what is European, what is not European, what is civilized, what is not civilized, and so forth, you know. And Liston is very, you know, comfortable in saying, you know, I've gone to these harems, I've made these observations, and on, you know, these kind of brief observations, she's very confident in kind of detailing or, you know, shaping the Turkish characteristic, you know, the women's characteristic. She finds them to be happy. She finds them to be cheerful. She finds that they're laughing. Although they may not be beautiful, it seems as if they're having a great life, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, she seems to think that observation is enough to kind of build upon a whole, you know, category.
I'm very aware that the clock is ticking. I wonder if we could wrap up just by saying a little bit about the responses that the Library commissioned from two Turkish women in particular. Dora, would you be able to say a little bit about those?
Sorry, I would. Thank you. Let's get them on screen. So as part of the project, which involved the digitization of Liston's journals, putting them online, as well as the publication, we commissioned a series of long reads from novelists and journalists, poets, artists, botanical artists, scholars, a number of scholars, and there's quite a collection. And these long reads look at the Liston's time in North America as well as in the Ottoman Empire. And there were two, as Patrick mentioned, that we wanted to pick out. And you can see these freely online on the online resource, and we've included the link to that in a later slide. So after this talk, you can go in and read them. There would be lots to pick on, lots of different kinds of writing, but a letter from EceTemelkuran, who responded as a fellow female traveller to Liston's journals, and it's a very personal reflection on what it's like to be a woman on the road. And there's a lovely passage at the end advising Henrietta to drink strong coffee with the Turkish women. And then a contrasting response, which we commissioned from Işık Güner, and that was not only an interview, but a botanical illustration. Henrietta, we've really briefly touched on, was a botanist, and in Turkey she collected lots of specimens. She was interested in bulbous plants, and we were lucky enough to speak to Işık about her own botanical art, and she drew for us, or painted for us, this beautiful watercolor of one of the irises that Henrietta would have seen while she was scouting for specimens and seeds in Turkey. And so we've now got this wonderful watercolor in our collection here at the library. There's an image of it on our website as well, and we will very soon be releasing the interview that Işık so generously gave us with Elif and Jan, two of Patrick's former students who interviewed her, and that looks at the richness of the flora of Turkey and links us back to one of the many reasons that Henrietta loved the country so much. And does that bring us almost to Q&A? Have I forgotten anything, Patrick?
No, I think that's everything. I'm sorry to everybody if that's felt a little rushed or conversely felt far too long. There's so much we'd like to talk about with you about Henrietta Liston and about these responses, these really wonderful responses from Işık Güner and from EceTemelkuran. I've put the link in the chat, so please do have a look for yourselves. But I think probably we should open this up at this point to questions. I know we've had a couple in the chat, but if anybody has any questions they want to ask in person, maybe we can open up to those and then address the ones in the chat if nothing's forthcoming.
And while that happens, perhaps we can just show the slide of the online resource where you can read all of Henrietta's writings and the full accounts of these Ottoman encounters. Patrick will just get up the slide in a moment. There it is. So this website contains all of Henrietta Liston's Turkish travel journals, as well as some interpretive material and the long reads that we've been mentioning. And we're going to keep adding to that batch of long reads over the next few months with further essays and the interview that I mentioned too. I could, while questions are coming through, just quickly answer Romy's question about Henrietta being orphaned. I'm sorry, I covered that rather quickly. So we don't have a great deal of concrete evidence, but we do know that she was orphaned by the age of 8. We have her record of her father's death, and she would have lost her mother before that. So from that time, there's not a great deal of documentation, but her parents they rented a sugar plantation in Antigua, and they would have kept enslaved people to work on that plantation. As for what kind of happened to that Antiguan side of the family, there's not a great deal of documentation. In kind of other sources, you can see how many Scottish families were in Antigua at the time, and that they'd been there really from the 1670s, mostly for sugar, the production of sugar and enslavement. So that's the kind of potted history of her early life, but very soon she goes to Glasgow, and the kind of Antiguan chapter isn't continued. Yeah, there's a lot to say. Somebody, thank you for this question about Henrietta's view on slavery, and we could do another whole event on this because it deserves full discussion. And I think one of the areas that needs further research is how Henrietta directly profited from chattel slavery, and really what was her family's relationship to that. Interestingly, when Henrietta goes to the United States, and not so much in the north, but as the Listons take trips down, they travel right down the eastern seaboard, and they go to South Carolina, North Carolina. Henrietta does witness slavery on a pretty vast scale, and the founding fathers she meets also own hundreds of slaves between them. But Henrietta does not comment in detail on this. It's kind of referenced factually, but without a great deal of interpretation. We do know that when Henrietta's father died, he left her for enslaved people. However, she never, I think, from everything that I've been able to find out so far, she never took ownership of these enslaved people, and it's very likely that they were freed not long after her father's death. However, her economic kind of benefit from the system of chattel slavery was pretty considerable, and we could maybe talk more about that another time. I know there's an excellent another question about Orientalism, which we should get to, but keep an eye on our long reads, because we'll be adding one soon from an excellent scholar, Lisa Williams, and she looks at Henrietta Liston and the part that slavery played in her world. So I hope that's enough for now. Maybe Patrick can look at the other question, maybe read it out and hand over. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Yes, we've got two questions that are perhaps could be taken as related and that perhaps Berak might be best placed to answer. One question from Angela, thank you, is, are there journals or writings describing these encounters from the Muslim women's point of view of Mrs. Liston?
Okay, now I know that further on into the 19th century, there are female writers who, you know, talk about encounters, who receive kind of foreign women into the harem. You know, Fatma Aliye Hanım was, you know, one of the Ottoman novelists of the period. Later, though, of the late 19th century, she kind of writes upon how she met with European travelers or writers and so forth. But I have yet, to my knowledge, I haven't seen anyone mentioning Henrietta Liston, but this is an interesting question, and this is something that I kind of feel curious about and will look into, because you know, the woman question and writings about and by women are actually going to become a matter later on with the next sultan, starting from 1839. This is rather a little bit early, perhaps, for Ottoman elite women to be writing about this, but this is a great question, and this is something that I will be looking further into. Okay, so
thank you, Berak. Sorry, struggling to unmute myself again. We had another question, and apologies to whoever asked it, because I think it was the first question actually asked, but it's perhaps a more complex one, so I wanted to save it. And I think, again, Berak, you're perhaps going to be best placed to answer it.
I'll try.
So someone has asked, was there an equivalent of the Orientalism towards the East, but held by Muslims towards the West in the 19th century? It's very easy to assume nobody in Scotland knew anything about Islam, but some Scottish clergymen did own copies of the Quran in the 17th century. It's hard to think some Muslims didn't also have similar prejudices or interests about Europe, but from their own side.
I think the 19th century is all about a love and hate for the West, or, you know, in the sense that on the one hand, Muslims would usually, you know, consider their culture superior to, the Westerners, to the infidels perhaps. But 19th century, or, you know, even beginning with kind of the 18th century, the beginning of military weakness of the Ottoman Empire, the loss of territories and territorial loss and all that, that brought with it the question of Ottoman reform, Ottoman modernization, which was basically at the beginning seen as something lacking at the level of the state. And if we go about, you know, filling that lacuna, which meant in the beginning military reform, we're all going to be fine. So at this point, there are questions about how is it that, you know, Westerners, over whom, you know, the glorious Ottoman armies were so victorious, what happened? How is it that now we're militarily weak, we're losing territory? Why is that the case? And this, of course, is going to bring with it, you know, discussions pertaining to religion. It's going to bring in questions pertaining to military, fiscal, and administrative practices. And we know that starting with, you know, Ernest Renan's sort of famous speech at the Sorbonne in 1882-83, there is this idea that Muslims and science and progress and modernity don't go together. So there's also this whole dynamic of trying to prove that Ottomans might not be Westerners, they're not Christians, but they're still a part of progress, of science, of modernization, of this modern world. So this is very much at the heart of 19th century discussions. You know, the West as a formidable enemy, but also the West, Europe at this point as being militarily, economically strong, and Ottoman modernization wanted to kind of take the tools of the enemy in order to make themselves strong so that they could become a part of, the modern world. So yes, Ottoman intellectuals, writers, politicians, we're all thinking about this question, and questions of identity, of course, are all kind of rolled up in this question of, is, the Ottoman Turk, can he be a part of modern civilization? Yes, and the Ottomans thought that, yes, of course, they could and they would and they should. I mean, we could speak hours about 19th century, so I don't want to take too much of our time.
Thank you, Berak.
Patrick, if there's no other question, I can ask one. But first of all, thank you so much. My goodness, it's been a riveting talk. I've loved it. My question is this: you've both been involved with this project for a long time as well. What was your personal highlight in the work, in this sort of exploration of this area of work, that you say, oh my God, I didn't know this? Anything you'd like to share with us, either Dora and yourself?
Dora, you've been working on this for longer than I have, so I think you should go first.
Which makes it so much harder to choose. I think, can I have an overarching personal highlight, which is how useful these manuscripts have become. They've, for a long time, lain rather unused, Henrietta's writing in the library's archives, and the library took them in 1936. There's not been a lot of work on them since then, and I think it's how they have been able to bring researchers and scholars from different disciplines together, and how I've been so privileged to work with people in Turkey and in the US and in other places in the world to unlock the value of Henrietta's writing. I hope that doesn't sound like a cop-out, and I'm not able to choose one particular revelatory document, but I think that's my overarching highlight.
Thank you.
I really second what Dora said. I think there's still so much work to be done as well, I think, and particularly by scholars like Berak, scholars familiar with the Turkish, the Ottoman contexts. And I think, the interest in Liston that comes from academic circles, but is by no means limited to academic circles, and that comes from Scotland, from America, from Turkey, and from all over the world, is that's been incredibly rewarding and exciting and occasionally terrifying. So I think that's really important. If I had a personal highlight, I think there is one letter, and I'm going to forget the details of it now, but there's a letter in the archive. And again, there's so much material there that we haven't yet published or digitized. But there's one letter that is written in Italian, but the hand, perhaps a little bit like the letter I shared earlier from the Sufi elder, the hand appears to be that of somebody much more familiar with writing, probably Ottoman Turkish script. So there's something of that to this Italian letter, and I think there was a wonderful moment in the opening event earlier where, and I'm terribly sorry, I've forgotten her name now, but I did make a note of it because I wanted to go back and look. There was a wonderful talk about calligraphy, and just seeing the hands of people writing in, in second, third, fourth, eighth, 10th languages, perhaps in the case of Robert, is very moving, I think. Dora, I'm not sure if you can remember anything else about that fantastic letter, but that's one that sort of stands out for me and that I want to go back to.
Yeah, I can't, but as you were speaking, I remembered the recipe for Turkish ink, which has been one of our favorite discoveries. There's a kind of a miscellaneous file of manuscripts that are kind of unsorted and not really categorized, and in that we found this very kind of small, papers really thin recipe for making Turkish ink. I wish we had an image of it here. Maybe Patrick, you can rustle one up, or I can in the next few minutes, but that's wonderful, and it's written almost poetically. And we like to think that Henrietta was using Turkish ink to write her journals with. We tried to do some scientific experiments with our conservation team to establish that, but it was kind of a little bit inconclusive, although the ink types were similar. But that was a wonderful discovery too.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Can I just ask Berik then? Berik, what about the impact of this work on you as a Turkish Muslim woman yourself? Because your outlook will be very fascinating, and you're looking at it from the inside, you know what it's like. And did that hold a conflict for you? Did it impact in any way, I mean, your interpretation of the situation?
Thank you very much for this question. I think Liston kind of inspired me because I'm someone who works on beauty and health and dress and fashion, and I often do that based on Ottoman sources of the 19th century. But I think Liston inspired me to actually kind of work maybe on another paper based on what I have, what I already know, and then contrast and compare it with Liston and other British travelers. Now, I can kind of empathize, or, I can feel along the same lines as Liston sometimes, because I've been abroad and I've been a Turkish woman abroad. And at the same time, I've also kind of, I'm here, I'm working on Ottoman documents. So it's actually inspired me to kind of perhaps carry out a more expansive, kind of expand my research, expand what I'm writing about. She's definitely inspired me, I think, to talk and, research into things that I haven't really perhaps thought about and so forth.
Okay, thank you so much, Berik. So any other question anybody want to ask? We've got 5 minutes. If not, we can call it a day. And I'll just see if there's can you see anything in the chat anywhere, Patrick? Any other comments or anything we can respond to? But I think it's been an amazing afternoon. When I heard about this, when you mentioned this, Patrick, many, many months ago, straight away, I found it fascinating, and I knew I wanted this panel here. And I can imagine what a treasure you have in your Scotland library. And we've been delighted to host you, and your research, your comments, what you shared with it, it's been riveting, as I've said earlier. So thank you so much, all of you, our presenters, and thank you to Katarzyna, who introduced the panel. And of course, thank you to my team. And finally, thank you to all our attendees, our guests who have joined us from across the world. I really are honored that you have joined us, and I know it was really worthwhile. Absolutely, mashallah. So we are going to call it a day today, but please, I have put the details in. If you're free, please join us for Islamophobia tomorrow, where we'll talk about what is it like for Muslims in Europe and in the USA. And the panelists are amazing people. And then in the evening, to round off our weekend festival, we've got comedy by a Somali comedian, Prince Abdi, with another comedian called Nabila Patan. These events are all free, but please do support us with donations if you can. So for the moment, goodbye from me and our wonderful hosts here. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.